Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to have with me Sam Tate. Sam is well known to the American audience, or at least the compliance podcast audience, because he's been on my pod previously. But we're here to talk about the failure to prevent fraud, which goes live on September 1. And Sam, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with us today.
Tom, it's a real pleasure to be invited back. I know I can't have done too bad a job last time for you to have me a second time, and I really enjoy these discussions, and I'm delighted to be here today.
Sam, since the last time we were able to visit, I believe you have changed venue to practice law. So I was wondering if we could start off by telling us where you're at now and the nature of your practice.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. So I'm the global head of regulatory and investigations at the law firm Clyde & Co, which is a global law firm of about 3,500 lawyers and about 500 partners, with 60 offices all over the world. We are where our clients are. And in my role as in regulatory and investigations, or in R&I as we call it in Clyde & Co, we have about 100 partners covering all kinds of areas that be relevant to your audience, Tom. Data privacy, ESG, health and safety, financial services regulation, of course, white collar crime and sanctions, and many more. And we bring those people together so that our clients have a one-stop shop.
So let's turn to the failure to prevent fraud. You previously detailed for us what that change to the law is, but could you maybe remind us about the changes and then we'll go into some of the new features of the law?
Sure. Well, it's a momentous change in the English law. So previously, it's been very difficult to prosecute large corporates for fraud. And this law changes that in the way that it changed it for bribery 15 years ago or so. It is a really significant change, and it brings with it a number of additional compliance requirements, which, as you know, many people in the US are not yet familiar with.
I guess the thing that struck me was these acts specified in the new law have always been illegal, at least maybe since Magna Carta, haven't they? And what's the codification and why is that such a change?
Well, you're absolutely right. So, fraud is fraud, and it's been with us since we emerged from the caves, probably. So, even before the Magna Carta. But it hasn't been easy to prosecute companies for fraud. So, historically, companies could only be prosecuted for fraud where their directors and officers were involved in the wrongdoing, something called the identification principle. But in relation to fraud, that is changing from the 1st of September. And companies will be liable, or certain companies will come onto the threshold tests for what a relevant company is, will be liable for the acts of any employee, any subsidiary, and any service provider, where they are for the benefit of the company. So if there's a fraud by any of those groups to the benefit of the company is automatically liable unless it has in place reasonable procedures, which are the compliance requirements that I mentioned. It's a prosecutor's charter. It makes it much, much easier to prosecute large corporates.
So the audience of this podcast is going to be at least half US domestic based. And one of the questions I'm getting from a lot of people here in the United States, even in the energy space, is okay, it's a UK law, certainly going to apply to UK companies. I'm energy service company in Houston, Texas. I've got some small UK operations. How does this apply to me, or why do I need to worry about this, Tom?
There's a few different angles to look at that, frankly, Tom. So the first thing is just to look at the jurisdiction of the act. So it's not just a act for companies that are incorporated or do business in the UK. Where you've got a fraud and there's any victim in the UK, or there's any act in the UK, and that could be an email or a meeting in any part of the fraud, or there's any benefits rolling up or through the UK financially, so you see money's going through the UK, then you've got jurisdiction. And when you think about how large businesses work, it's pretty difficult to tell it's pretty difficult to say that they would never have a victim in the UK, or they would never have and act in the UK, because those victims could be, and we'll get into this when we talk about scenarios, they could be shareholders who've been defrauded, they could be purchasers of goods, they could be people in procurement who've been lied to. So there's a whole range of scenarios, and it's just very difficult to separate out the UK from a jurisdictional perspective. The other thing I would say is there's a real interest for the prosecutors in going after foreign incorporated and located companies. So there is an interest in pursuing them. They may not be interested in us, but we're interested in them, I think, is what the prosecutors would say. And then there's another couple of points I'd make. One is that, well, forget jurisdiction, but care about your banks and your supply chain. Just as with bribery, you will start seeing new contracts which have in the boilerplate, somewhere at the end, paragraphs which say, are you compliant with the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, Section 199 requirements? And you're going to be asked for certifications. You and I both have an oil and gas background from your joint venture partners as to whether or not you comply. And you're going to have to say yes or no to that. And the same with your banks, in the way that they will ask whether you're compliant with, say, sanctions. Now they'll ask if you're compliant with failure to prevent fraud offences. So you can't really separate yourself from them, because there's no supply chains anymore, it's supply networks. So even large US companies may find themselves as service providers for smaller or mid-tier UK companies, and those UK companies will see the US companies as presenting them with a risk, which they have to resolve by asking for certifications and making sure they have their programs in place. So it's an interesting one, because when we had, first of all, the FCPA, of course, in 1977, and then much later on a whole slew of other bribery acts or bribery-related legislation, they all came as one kind of around the globe, whereas this feels a lot more like the UK going out a bit on a limb. But having said that, it's still quite an important economy, and lots of things cross over in the UK, which mean that it's likely to be relevant to an awful lot of companies.
Perhaps the most interesting thing you said in all of that is the market response and how the market will require compliance, whether that's a contractual counterparty, whether that's a bank, perhaps loaning money, maybe even an insurance company who's
Yeah.
looking at putting cover on a company on a UK or even a worldwide basis. And that's what I saw in the FCPA world. Perhaps you saw nearly the same thing in the Bribery Act world, where it was the companies that not sort of, self enforced the law by requiring certification from their business partners.
Right, that's exactly it. And I think it will work in the same way. It might take a little while for that to get going, but it is going to happen. And I expect that there will be enforcement, which will also focus the minds. And then the other thing which I see, because I've had similar discussions to you, working with US clients, they say, well, can't we just separate out the UK bit? And I say, can you? Because businesses are verticalized, they have businesses and sectors that run globally, and they really will struggle to separate out the UK bit. And even if they can do that on day one, can you say that that will be the same in 6 months or a year's time? And do you want to have separate resources to meet these requirements? Now, what does that look like? So that the practicalities of separating out and having a spin-off UK specific compliance program for fraud are actually quite hard to do.
Well, I can certainly point to a direct example of that from the Bribery Act, where any contract with British Petroleum or BP required a certification that you complied with the Bribery Act, which meant no facilitation payments. And if you were a US company which had facilitation payments, that meant you had to have a separate line item in your accounting for that, and you had to be able to certify to BP. And better hope you didn't send somebody who hadn't worked on the BP account before to West Africa, because they were going to make a facilitation payment. And now you're in violation of your BP contract. Now, did BP worry about that? Maybe. But your point is absolutely spot on that it's impossible to have dual compliance programs. I mean, I guess in theory you can, but it's just with the mix of employees literally on a worldwide basis, it's impractical.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think lots of companies have come to that realization. They just go through the same process. So do we have to do it? Yes, we do. If we do have to do it, can we do it in a small way? And of course, you ought to be proportionate and reasonable in what you do. But I think it's quite difficult to separate it out. And the other thing I'd say there is that when you look at it from a kind of policy infrastructure in a company, they will nearly always define fraud as theft and embezzlement. That's really what they mean: expenses fraud, procurement fraud, things like that. Whereas the scenarios will come on to this for failure to prevent fraud in the UK are mostly about fraudulent misrepresentation by the company to others outside of the company. So that is where the company is not the victim. The company is the perpetrator. And that isn't really considered by most fraud policies. So you'd have to have two different fraud policies in your company about what fraud is. That's not very desirable. And because as you'll appreciate, you want to have as neat a structure for your policies as you can, so that they're easy to find and everybody understands them.
Let me turn to the UK prosecutors in the Serious Fraud Office. He's not the new head of the SFO, but you have a change in the head of the SFO who seems to have a different focus. He's not a lawyer, he's a police officer. And what I'm wondering is, does this law put more, as we would say, arrows in the quiver of prosecutors, or give them more ammunition to investigate and bring charges?
So yes, I mean, they've been campaigning for this change for a decade or more. Nick F. Grave is the beneficiary of a lot of hard work by prosecutors before him, NGOs, and of course, to some extent, himself and his team for bringing about this new piece of legislation. And they are excited. They want to be able to use it. And you cannot go to a meeting now with the SFO without them saying how keen they are to prosecute companies using this exciting new tool.
And could you give us some examples of, you touched on some of the behaviors that this offense will cover, but could you maybe spend a little more time talking about those, and if possible, some of the questions or areas you're getting questioned on at this point?
I think this is really important. I mean, when I give talks on this, I say, if you take nothing else away, just take away that this is fraud, but not as we know it. And so forget embezzlement and theft. This is all about crimes by the company where third parties are victims. So what does that mean? Greenwashing. So if a company misleads its customers about its green claims and they buy its products, well, then it's lied to them. There's a deceit element to it, and they would be victims of that crime. If you have mis-selling, as we did in the UK around insurance that was sold to customers of banks on their lending products, the PPI scandal, the banks knew that these customers didn't need this protection, but they sold it to them anyway, telling them that they did need it. That's another good example. So there's mis-selling, mislabeling, it's sometimes called in drugs markets. So where people know, if you knew that the drug that you were selling did not have the positive effects that you had put on the label or in the marketing, that would be an area. And then there were some pretty interesting areas when you think about it. And I've done really quite a lot of work in this area now. So if you're a charity and you look for more charitable donations from the state or from third parties, and you significantly overstate, knowingly deceive the donor about how well your other programs have gone, well, they're giving you money on the basis of that lie. If you're seeking regulatory approvals, for this, that, or the other, and you misstate what your experience is, or what you plan to bring, or what you know you can deliver. Well, again, this is all fraudulent misrepresentation. If you're a law firm and you overstate to your clients what your experience is, or what band you are in chambers, or then again, you've got this fraudulent misrepresentation. And so in all of these areas, basically any lie that a company tells for its own benefit, or its subsidiaries tell, or any of its employees tell, or any of its service providers tell, that's what you're liable for. And that changes the nature of the risk, actually, because when we think, Tom, you and I have talked about this before around bribery risk, well, there's a strong tie to jurisdiction. So, their bribes are more likely to be paid to government officials in Lagos than in London. But if you tell me that there are more lies in Lagos than London, well, I don't know if that's right. It certainly makes you pause to think about it, doesn't it? Because the risks here for large corporates are that perhaps some of that deceit comes from the top of the company and not from the bottom of the company. So knowing the deceitful statements, say, by C-suite members. So, for instance, we thinking about investigations, Tom. If a CEO was to come out and say we're absolutely sure there is no issue here, and he knew that that wasn't true, because there was a big investigation going on in the background. Well, you pumped up the share price, which otherwise would have gone down. And if is that knowing deceit, you've got those statements from the top of the shop. So I think you have to think of the risk differently in relation to this sort of fraud than you might do for, say, bribery, and then that plays through things like your risk assessment.
What should companies do now, or perhaps I can even specify it further, as a company calls you and says, Sam, it's now nearly August. Where do we start?
Well, you should have started in March, would be. But given you kind of are where you are, the key document is the government statutory guidance that was published in November of last year. And it's about 30 pages long. So that's really the key, because it's meeting those guidance requirements, which is your only defense. And you've got to have those things in at the time of the wrongdoing. So they'll in all likelihood now, Tom, if a client came to me now and said we need to put in our program before the beginning of September, I would say, well, you probably can't. You could make a good faith start on it, and you should, with a risk assessment and gap analysis, but you'll be looking over 3 to 6 months to put in this program, and you may have many of those relevant requirements in place anyway, but you'll need to be able to map them to make sure that you have a complete program. So the guidance is something I worked on. So I was lucky enough to be on the City of London Corporate Crime Subcommittee, which provided input to the guidance, and happily the government took up a number of our recommendations and quite a bit, Tom, of my wording. So I would say go to someone, if you want to go quickly, go to someone who's done a lot of it, who's really familiar with the guidance and with the motivations behind each piece of it. That's what you should be doing. We're not at a point in this where it's a kind of cookie cutter approach. In like the Bribery Act, 10, 15 years down the line, people are very used to it, but there's not the knowledge in the market of how to do this, and there's not established practice in the way there is for the Bribery Act. You probably need to go to someone who knows the area and does work in the area frequently.
Sam, you said something in that answer I wanted to pick up on. And one of the things I've been thinking about as you've been talking is, how does this map to both American law and American corporate response? And many of the areas of fraud you articulated in the fraud but not as we know it section would be handled by different parts of a corporate legal department, or and indeed a corporation's. So a large corporation might have a fraud or fraud examiner department who may look at fraud against the company. The general counsel's office may look at statements made by the corporation that would go in a 10K or 8Q, or 10Q and 8K. And there would be a vetting of publicly made statements. There would be lawyers who would look at anti-competitive statements or antitrust issues, so that there could be, as you suggested, a variety of different corporate functions looking at these issues. And I was very intrigued by your thoughts around mapping that, and at least putting together some sort of coherent way to look at this in the context of the Failure to Prevent Fraud Act. Have you had to go through that type of exercise yet?
I have many times, and so companies do approach it in different ways. I think one quite good solution is to put in place a steering committee with membership from across those different stakeholders, and to do that at the get-go, because you're going to need their support and in implementing any changes and in helping with the mapping exercise. And so I think that is a successful strategy that I've seen deployed. But it is more than simply a mapping. SOX compliance is helpful, but it's not enough. Looking at your advertising requirements is helpful, but it's not enough. And then there are some oddities around the guidance. I mean, you having been negotiated the last two DPAs with the SFO and been a monitor for the SFO, they will work through the guidance and they will see if you have met all the requirements. It's not enough to say we met some other laws requirements. In X, Y, or Z. So, for instance, if I just give a for instance, for risk assessments, you need to use the fraud triangle, and you need to have a mention of emergency procedures and what you do in that event. And that isn't something which is common to risk assessments. It's not common to bribery and corruption risk assessments. So you might have some things which are similar, but they won't be enough. So the mapping needs to be done quite carefully. But taking another example, for instance, in pharma, they will have really incredible levels of control in relation to the labeling of their products and the testing and the claims that they made. I'm not saying for one moment that they ought to meet some new higher standards because of what's in the guidance for the failure to prevent fraud offence, but there may be some other areas where there's less focus. So statements made, for instance, on green bonds, if they've got those, there may be less control over sales agents and distributors. There may be less controls in relation to influencers, which which companies are now used in order to sell their goods, and for whom you might well be responsible. So companies have normally treated that sort of risk as being a non-criminal matter. But now it's a criminal matter, and one, and I should have mentioned this earlier, Tom, that not only the SFO can prosecute, but you can have private prosecutors who bring actions. So if you have disgruntled shareholders or clients, they may bring a criminal action in the UK against you. They don't have to wait for the SFO. There are private prosecutions which I have led and responded to, which are a feature of our landscape in the UK, and which US corporates should be aware of.
Sam, could I end by asking you, how do you assess the likely impact of this new law on international entities and regulated entities?
I mean, I think this is going to be quite a significant change for a lot of companies. And in terms of banks, if I can start with them, right, they sought different guidance, which would only impact their industry, but they didn't succeed in obtaining that. So there's actually, I'll get a bit technical, but it's open under the statutory guidance to have sector specific statutory guidance, but there isn't any for banks. So they have to navigate through some general guidance, which is more aimed at corporates than it is at banks. So that requires them to really engage with it and think about what it means for their industry. That's one point. And banks are very much in the crosshairs, because one of the reasons the SFO wants this legislation is because post the financial crisis of 2008, it wasn't successful in bringing prosecutions against banks because the fraud legislation as it stood at the time wasn't easy to use to bring those prosecutions, as we discussed. So banks should care about this, and banks are definitely in the crosshairs of this. And as for multinational corporates, for all the reasons I've given, I think that you've got more scenarios which involve head office, you've got scenarios which involve shareholders and investors of different types. So PE should care about this, corporates should care about this because they've all got customers. That's what they have in common. And they're all likely to have some kind of link to the UK. So that's the nature of being multinational.
Sam, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. We're going to link to the Clyde & Co. Website in the show notes. So I wanted to thank you again, and I can rest assured that we will be visiting on this again down the road.
Well, I look forward to that. And look, thank you very much for inviting me on again, Tom. It's been a great pleasure to spend time with you.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet. Every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.